It is May 29, 1453. Dawn is barely breaking over the Bosphorus. The greatest city in the Christian world, a city that has stood for over 1,000 years, is burning. The last Roman emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, pulls off his imperial regalia, throws it to the ground, and charges into the Ottoman army alone. He dies in the chaos. No one even finds his body. And as the city falls, as the Hagia Sophia fills with terrified civilians praying for a miracle, the question hanging in the smoke-filled air is this: where was everyone else? Where were the other Christian kingdoms? Where was the Pope? Where was Venice? Where was Hungary? Where was France? The Byzantine Empire had been begging for help for decades. And what they got was almost nothing. Today we are going to answer one of the most haunting questions in all of medieval history. Why didn't the Christians help during the Siege of Constantinople? And the answer, I promise you, is far more complicated, far more human, and far more tragic than you might think. Before we talk about why help never came, we need to understand what Constantinople actually was, because without that, none of this makes sense. Constantinople was not just a city. It was the city. Founded by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great in 330 AD, it was built to be the new capital of the Roman Empire, a second Rome, planted at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. For over 1,000 years, while Western Europe collapsed, fragmented, and slowly rebuilt itself from the wreckage of Rome, Constantinople held. The walls held off the Huns, the Avars, the Arabs, the Rus, the Bulgarians, the Crusaders. It held against everyone. At its height in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian, the Byzantine Empire controlled the entire Mediterranean. Its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Hagia Sophia, built in 537 AD, was the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years. Its mosaics, its libraries, its scholars, Constantinople was the keeper of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge when that knowledge existed nowhere else in the world. But by 1453, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The Byzantine Empire by the mid-15th century was a ghost of what it had been. Its territory had shrunk to almost nothing, essentially just Constantinople itself, a few Greek islands, and the Peloponnese. The population of the city, which had once been 500,000, was now maybe 50,000. Maybe less. The empire was broke. It could barely pay its own soldiers. Its walls, those legendary walls, were crumbling in places because there was no money to repair them. And pressing against those walls from all sides was the Ottoman Empire, young, aggressive, and led by one of the most brilliant military minds of the 15th century, Sultan Mehmed II, who was just 21 years old when he ordered the siege. Mehmed had been obsessed with Constantinople since childhood. He had read everything about it, Roman history, Greek texts, military manuals. He is said to have recited lines from Homer. He called himself the rightful heir to the Roman Empire. And he wanted that city with an intensity that bordered on obsession. So Emperor Constantine XI did what any ruler in his position would do. He sent out letters. He sent out ambassadors. He begged. Please. Help us. Or we all fall. And now we get to the heart of our story, because the responses he received were complicated. To understand why Western Christians were so reluctant to help Byzantium, you have to understand the Great Schism of 1054. This was one of the most consequential events in all of religious history, and it is also one of the least understood by most people. In 1054, after centuries of growing tensions, the Christian Church split into two. The Western Church, based in Rome, led by the Pope, became the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern Church, based in Constantinople, led by the Patriarch, became the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, on the surface, this might seem like a minor administrative disagreement. It was not. The split was about theology, power, and identity, and it cut deep. Catholics and Orthodox Christians disagreed about the nature of the Holy Spirit. They disagreed about whether the Pope had authority over the entire church or just the western portion. They used different liturgical languages. Latin in the west, Greek in the east. Their church art looked different. Their calendar differed. Their clergy dressed differently. And crucially, they did not like each other. From the Orthodox perspective, the Latins, as they called Western Christians, were schismatics at best and heretics at worst. There was genuine theological contempt going in both directions. This tension exploded into outright hatred during the Fourth Crusade of 1204. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to go to Egypt and then Jerusalem. Instead, through a combination of debt, political manipulation, and opportunism, the Crusaders ended up attacking Constantinople. And what happened next was one of the great atrocities of the medieval world. For 3 days, Western Christian Crusaders sacked Constantinople. They looted the churches. They stole relics. They melted down sacred objects for gold. They reportedly desecrated the Hagia Sophia. Greek sources describe nuns being raped, priests being killed at the altar, and priceless manuscripts being burned. The Crusaders established a Latin empire in Constantinople that lasted from 1204 to 1261, and during those 57 years, the Byzantines never forgot what had been done to them. When a Byzantine historian named Nicetas Choniates wrote about the sack, he said something that echoed down the centuries: the Saracens, meaning the Muslims, are more merciful and kind than these men who bear the cross of Christ. So when Constantinople sent out desperate letters to the Pope and Western Christian rulers in the 1450s, asking for help against the Ottomans, those letters were landing in a context where Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians had several centuries of mutual hostility behind them. And that hostility was not abstract. It was personal, theological, and visceral. The Byzantines needed Western help. But they despised the Westerners. And the Westerners, while perhaps feeling some Christian solidarity in theory, had their own complicated feelings about the Orthodox Greeks. This is the foundational tension of everything that follows. Pope Nicholas V, who was the Pope in 1453, genuinely wanted to help Constantinople. He wasn't indifferent. He understood what was at stake. But the Pope had a price. His price was union. Church union. The Eastern Orthodox Church had to formally submit to the authority of Rome, accept Catholic theology including the disputed clause about the Holy Spirit, the Filioque, and recognize the Pope as the supreme head of the universal Church. This was not a new demand. It had been the Catholic position for centuries. And there had actually been an attempt to meet it. In 1438 and 1439, a major council was held, first in Ferrara, then in Florence, to negotiate the union of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Emperor John VIII Palaiologos, Constantine's predecessor, attended in person. The negotiations were real and serious. In July 1439, the Council of Florence produced a decree of union. The Orthodox representatives signed it. The Eastern Church formally, officially reunited with Rome. And then the whole thing collapsed. When the Greek delegation returned to Constantinople, they were met with outrage. The population, the clergy, the monks, the ordinary people, rejected the union furiously. One prominent Byzantine scholar and church official named Lucas Notaras reportedly said something that became famous: he would rather see the Turkish turban in Constantinople than the Latin mitre. Whether he actually said this is disputed by historians, but the sentiment was real. Many Orthodox Christians genuinely preferred Ottoman conquest to submission to Rome. The union was declared in the Hagia Sophia in December 1452, just months before the siege. But it was a dead letter. Ordinary Byzantines refused to accept it. Orthodox clergy in the city refused to take communion with the Latin rite. The union existed on paper and almost nowhere else. From the Pope's perspective, this was maddening. He had been promised union. He was trying to organize a crusade. He called for one in September 1453 after the city fell, and again after, but the cooperation was never fully there from the Byzantine side, and the military response from Western kings was anemic. From the Byzantine perspective, what the Pope was demanding was humiliation. It was asking them to betray their faith, their identity, everything they had built, in exchange for help that might never actually materialize. This was the impossible bargain at the heart of Byzantine-Papal relations in the 1450s. And no one could find a way out of it. Now let's talk about the two Italian city-states that had the most power to actually do something militarily, Venice and Genoa. Both cities had massive commercial empires in the eastern Mediterranean. Both had colonies and trading posts throughout the region, including in Constantinople itself. The Genoese had an entire colony called Galata, or Pera. Directly across the Golden Horn from Constantinople, close enough that you could see the city's walls from the waterfront. You might think, surely Venice and Genoa would fight to protect their investments, their colonies, their trade routes? The answer is, yes and no. And the reasons are fascinating. Venice. Venice had a complicated history with Byzantium. Remember the Fourth Crusade? Venice had been deeply involved in organizing it and had profited enormously from the sack of Constantinople. Venetian ships had carried the Crusaders. Venetian merchants had taken many of the looted treasures, including the famous bronze horses that still sit atop St. Mark's Basilica in Venice today, which were stolen from the Hippodrome of Constantinople. By the 1450s, Venice did have significant trade interests in Constantinople and the Black Sea region. And Venice did want to defend those interests. But Venice was also exhausted. The city-state had been fighting a brutal war against Milan in northern Italy for years. They were financially strained. And they had another, perhaps more pressing concern: they also had an extensive trade network with the Ottoman Empire. Offending Mehmed II, or getting into a military conflict with him, was not something Venetian merchants took lightly. When Constantine XI sent his appeals to Venice, the Venetian Senate debated. They were genuinely torn. They voted to send a relief fleet. They organized it. And then, they delayed. And delayed. The fleet was being prepared when the city fell. It arrived too late. Was this deliberate? Was it incompetence? Or was it the ordinary fog of bureaucracy in a republic that made decisions by committee? Historians have argued about this for centuries. The most likely answer is that it was all three. A mixture of genuine intent, genuine hesitation, and the grinding slowness of collective decision-making. A small group of Venetian ships and soldiers were actually in Constantinople during the siege. They fought bravely. One Venetian captain named Giacomo Cocco tried to break the Ottoman naval blockade and died doing it. But the main fleet Venice promised? It never came in time. Genoa. The Genoese situation is even more interesting, and darker. The Genoese colony at Galata was in an extraordinary position. They were directly adjacent to the besieged city. They could see the Ottoman cannons firing from their walls. They were, in a very real sense, right in the middle of the conflict. And the Genoese colony officially tried to stay neutral. This seems insane. But understand the logic: the Genoese of Galata had negotiated a position of relative privilege with the Ottomans. They had trade agreements. They had a formal relationship. If they fought against the Ottomans, Mehmed would destroy them. If they helped Constantinople, they would lose everything they had built. So officially, they tried to play both sides. Unofficially, some Genoese soldiers did join the defense of Constantinople. Most notably, a Genoese mercenary captain named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo arrived with 700 soldiers and became one of the most effective commanders in the city's defense. He was brilliant, experienced, and brave, and Constantine XI trusted him completely, giving him command of the most critical section of the walls. But Giustiniani was acting on his own initiative, not at the direction of Genoa. He was a private military contractor, essentially, who had come for pay and perhaps for glory. And then, near the end of the siege, Giustiniani was wounded, shot through the hand or arm, possibly the chest, the sources disagree. He requested to leave the walls to have his wound treated. And this is where history becomes truly tragic. Constantine XI, according to some accounts, begged him to stay. Giustiniani left anyway. He was carried to a Genoese ship and evacuated from the city. He died a few days later on the island of Chios. When the other defenders saw their best commander being carried away from the walls, it broke morale. Shortly after, the Ottomans broke through. Would the city have held if Giustiniani had stayed? We cannot know. But history has not been entirely kind to him. The Genoese colony at Galata, incidentally, surrendered peacefully to Mehmed II as soon as the city fell. Their neutrality had been, ultimately, a calculation about survival. And they survived. Whether it was honorable? That is another question. Let's zoom out and look at the broader picture. What about Hungary? What about France? What about the Holy Roman Empire? What about Aragon, or England, or Poland? The answer involves several overlapping crises happening simultaneously across Europe. The 100 Years' War. England and France had been fighting each other for over a century. The 100 Years' War officially ran from 1337 to 1453, and notice that end date. It ended in 1453, the same year Constantinople fell. France and England were militarily exhausted, financially drained, and utterly consumed with their own conflict. Neither kingdom had the capacity or inclination to organize a crusade to the other end of the continent. The wars in Italy. The Italian city-states, which included the most powerful military forces and the most sophisticated financial systems in Europe, were constantly fighting each other. Milan versus Venice. Florence versus Naples. The Pope versus everyone, it sometimes seemed. The Italian political situation was a constantly shifting mess of alliances and betrayals that made coordinating any unified action nearly impossible. Hungary. Hungary is a particularly important case because Hungary was on the Ottoman Empire's doorstep. The Hungarians had been fighting the Ottomans for decades and understood the threat better than almost anyone in Europe. John Hunyadi, the great Hungarian military commander, had actually won a famous victory against the Ottomans at the Battle of Belgrade in 1456, 3 years after Constantinople fell. He was capable. He was willing to fight. But in 1453, Hunyadi and the Hungarian kingdom were in a complicated political situation. Hungary was dealing with internal power struggles. Hunyadi's relationship with the young King Ladislaus V was tense and complicated. Organizing and funding a major military expedition was politically difficult. And there was another factor, the failed Crusade of Varna. In 1444, a crusading army, led by King Vladislaus of Hungary and Poland, with Hunyadi as his military commander, had marched to fight the Ottomans. It ended in catastrophe at the Battle of Varna. Vladislaus was killed. The army was destroyed. The memory of Varna was fresh in 1453, and it made European kings very reluctant to commit to another major military adventure against the Ottomans. The Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, which covered roughly modern Germany and Austria, was in a state of almost perpetual internal chaos. The Emperor Frederick III was involved in constant conflicts with princes, cities, and rival claimants. He had no unified military to deploy, and he was not going to sacrifice his domestic position for a distant city. The other Orthodox nations. What about Serbia? What about Bulgaria? What about the other Orthodox Christian peoples? By 1453, many of them were already under Ottoman control, or so close to it that they had no real choice. Serbia had been paying tribute to the Ottomans for decades. Bulgaria had been conquered. The Byzantine Empire, in a terrible irony, was now the last Orthodox Christian power of any significance, and it was asking other people for help. There were also Orthodox nations to the north and east, Russia, for example. But Russia in 1453 was just emerging from Mongol domination. The Grand Duchy of Moscow was not yet a major power capable of projecting military force thousands of miles to the south. Here is something that often gets lost in the story of why the Christians didn't help. Even if more help had come, it might not have been enough. Mehmed II brought something to this siege that changed everything: the cannon. Not just any cannons, enormous ones. The most famous was designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orbán, who had originally offered his services to Constantine XI. Constantine couldn't afford him. Mehmed II could. Orbán went to the Ottoman court and built for Mehmed what may have been the largest cannon the world had ever seen. This cannon, called the Great Bombard or Basilica, was so large it reportedly took 60 oxen and 400 men to transport. It fired stone balls weighing up to 1,500 pounds. The sound of its firing could be heard from miles away. Buildings reportedly shook from its concussive force. And it was pointed at those legendary Theodosian walls. The walls of Constantinople had stood for 1,000 years precisely because no technology existed to breach them. They were 18 feet thick at their base. They were layered, outer wall, moat, inner wall. They had survived siege after siege. But they had been built before gunpowder artillery. They had never faced anything like this. The Great Bombard could only fire a handful of times per day, it overheated and had to be cooled. But each shot caused catastrophic damage. And Mehmed had many other cannons supporting it. The defenders repaired the walls at night. The Ottomans broke them again by day. Slowly, inexorably, the balance shifted. Mehmed also made a tactical masterstroke that stunned the defenders. He had his fleet transported overland, on greased logs, bypassing the chain that the Byzantines had stretched across the Golden Horn to block the harbor. One morning the defenders woke up to find Ottoman ships inside the Golden Horn. Their flank was exposed. Their harbor was threatened. The psychological impact was enormous. And Mehmed had numbers, around 80,000 soldiers by most estimates, facing a defending force of perhaps 7,000 to 10,000. Even with reinforcements, even with more Venetian or Genoese ships, the odds were brutal. This doesn't excuse the failure to send help. It does contextualize it. Those Western kings and city-states were being asked to send forces into a conflict that many of them privately recognized as probably unwinnable. Let's spend a moment inside the city, because there is a story inside this story that is equally important. The Byzantine court and people were not united. They were bitterly divided. And their divisions made their situation worse. The central divide was the union question. The agreement signed at Florence in 1439, reuniting the Catholic and Orthodox churches, was still officially in force in 1453. But as I mentioned earlier, it was deeply, furiously opposed by a large portion of the population. The Orthodox Church had a senior official, the Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, the one who may have said he preferred the Turkish turban to the Latin mitre. Who was one of the most powerful men in the city. He was opposed to union. He was opposed to begging the Catholics for help. He believed, or perhaps hoped, that the Ottomans would be manageable. He was catastrophically wrong. After the fall, Mehmed II had Notaras executed, along with his son, but his opposition, and the broader opposition he represented, had real consequences during the siege. When Pope Nicholas V sent a cardinal named Isidore to Constantinople to formally declare the union and receive the city's submission to Rome. Something that was supposed to unlock Western support, the ceremony in the Hagia Sophia was met with horror by many Byzantines. Some clergy and monks refused to participate. Priests refused to celebrate Mass in the same space where Latin rites had been performed. The city was fighting for its life while simultaneously tearing itself apart over theology. There were also significant numbers of people who had simply given up. The empire had been dying for so long. The sense of doom was pervasive. Some people had left the city. Some wealthy Byzantine families had been quietly relocating to Italy or the Greek islands for years, taking their valuables with them. Constantine XI himself seems to have been a genuinely noble figure, brave, principled, determined. But he was leading a population that was not entirely behind him, governing an empire that was bankrupt, begging for help from people who mistrusted him, while facing an enemy of overwhelming force. It is remarkable, in retrospect, that the city held as long as it did, 53 days under full siege. The end came on May 29, 1453. The Ottomans had been probing the walls for weeks, looking for weaknesses. In the early hours of the morning, Mehmed launched a massive assault, wave after wave of soldiers thrown at the walls. The Janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry, broke through a small gate called the Kirkaporta, which had been left unlocked by accident or negligence. Once they were inside the walls, the defense collapsed rapidly. Constantine XI reportedly died fighting. His body was never found, though some accounts say he was identified later by his boots. He became a legend. In Greek folklore, he became the Marble King, the Marmaromegas, said to sleep in a cave beneath Constantinople, waiting to wake and reclaim the city. The Hagia Sophia, with thousands of refugees sheltering inside, was breached. The people inside were enslaved. The city was looted for 3 days. Mehmed had promised his soldiers this, as was the medieval custom for a city taken by force rather than surrendered. When Mehmed II rode into the city on the afternoon of May 29, he went directly to the Hagia Sophia. He had it converted to a mosque. He reportedly wept at its beauty. He then declared himself Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome. He was the new Roman emperor. In his mind, he had not destroyed Rome, he had inherited it. The news, when it reached Western Europe, was received with shock. Pope Nicholas V was reportedly devastated. He called for a new crusade. Nothing came of it. But something else happened that matters enormously. The Byzantine scholars, who had been leaving Constantinople for years before the fall, continued to leave after it. They came to Italy, to Venice, to Florence, to Rome, carrying manuscripts of ancient Greek texts that had been preserved in Constantinople for centuries. Plato, Aristotle, Homer, mathematical and scientific works. These manuscripts, and the scholars who could read them, fed directly into what we call the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople was a catastrophe. But the knowledge it scattered across Europe helped ignite one of the greatest intellectual revivals in human history. Whether that trade-off was worth it is a question that has no answer. We've covered a lot of ground. Let me pull it all together. Why didn't the Christians help during the Siege of Constantinople? The answer is not one thing. It is many things, layered on top of each other, reinforcing each other. 1. The Great Schism made Christian solidarity a fiction. A century of theological hostility, culminating in the traumatic sack of 1204, meant that Catholic and Orthodox Christians did not see themselves as members of the same community. Western Christians felt varying degrees of obligation to help Constantinople, but it was always balanced against deep mistrust and contempt. 2. The Pope's price was too high. The Catholic Church demanded church union, submission to Rome, as the price for organized military support. The Byzantines who agreed to this deal found that the agreement didn't translate into real soldiers. And those who rejected it, who refused on principle to submit to Rome, were helping seal the city's fate. 3. Western Europe was consumed by its own crises. The 100 Years' War, the wars in Italy, the internal politics of Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire. Every major power had reasons why a crusade to Constantinople was difficult or impossible right now. There is never a perfect moment to do a hard thing. For the Byzantine Empire, that imperfect moment never arrived. 4. The memory of Varna poisoned Western appetite for risk. After the catastrophic defeat in 1444, European kings were deeply reluctant to commit to another major military confrontation with the Ottomans. The Ottomans were formidable. Everyone knew it. 5. Commercial interests complicated everything. Venice and Genoa had economic relationships with the Ottoman Empire that they were unwilling to sacrifice. The calculus of merchants, even patriotic or religiously motivated merchants, included self-interest, and self-interest often counseled caution. 6. The Byzantines themselves were divided. A population and leadership that was fighting internally over theology and politics, that was refusing union in ways that undercut the case for Western help, that had some powerful figures who preferred Ottoman rule to Latin interference. This was not a client that inspired confidence in potential allies. 7. The situation was probably unwinnable. Even the help that might have come, more Venetian ships, more Genoese soldiers, would have been arriving to face an overwhelming force equipped with revolutionary military technology. Not impossible to survive, perhaps, but very difficult. Western rulers were being asked to invest enormously in a very uncertain outcome. And so the city fell. I want to end with something a little different, because I think this story, as tragic as it is, has things to teach us that go beyond the history itself. The Fall of Constantinople is often told as a simple story of betrayal. The Christians abandoned their brothers and sisters in the East. The West let the East fall. Christian solidarity failed at the crucial moment. That story is not wrong, exactly. But it is incomplete. What the full history shows us is how catastrophically difficult it is for people with a common enemy to unite when they are also divided among themselves. The Byzantines and the Western Christians shared a faith, shared a sense of civilizational heritage, and faced a common threat. And they still could not coordinate effectively because the grievances between them, real grievances, going back centuries, were stronger than the fear that should have united them. It shows us how institutional structures, the Church's demand for union, Venice's need for Senate votes, the Pope's dependence on kings who had their own priorities, can prevent rapid, effective action even when everyone privately acknowledges that action is necessary. It shows us how short-term commercial interests can dominate over long-term strategic thinking. The Genoese colony at Galata thought they were being smart, staying neutral, protecting their trade. They survived the fall. And yet the world they had been calculating so carefully to preserve, the world of Byzantine Constantinople and its commercial networks, was gone. And it shows us something about hope and despair. Constantine XI, who died on those walls, had very good reasons to give up. His empire was tiny. His treasury was empty. His allies were unreliable. His population was divided. And yet he chose to fight. He pulled off his regalia and walked into the battle. The city fell. But Constantinople's legacy, in the manuscripts scattered across Italy, in the Greek scholars who taught the Renaissance, in the Eastern Orthodox Church that survived Ottoman rule and persists to this day, in the memory of an emperor who chose honor over escape, that did not fall. History is not always a story of justice. Sometimes the good guys lose. Sometimes the walls come down despite everyone's best efforts, and sometimes because of everyone's worst failures. What we owe to the dead is to look at what happened clearly, not to find easy villains, but to understand the full, complicated, heartbreaking human reality of how we sometimes fail each other when it matters most. And perhaps to ask ourselves, are we doing the same thing today? Are there walls somewhere, being pounded by cannons, while the rest of us argue about theology, count our money, and wait for a better moment? Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453. The better moment never came.